nuclei, and they have these axons that go into the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is going into the blood, and you have actions or milk ejection if it's about breastfeeding. Now, these nerves you all know about, don't you? That it's a hormonal action of oxytocin. But at the same time, you have actually collaterals from these nerves, which are the same neurons that go to the parts of the pituitary where it controls the stress axis, but even to the amygdala. That means that when these neurons are activated, you will have, either if you want it or not, a calming effect in the amygdala. And then in addition, you have these sort of parvocellular neurons, which come from only the paraventricular nucleus. And this is a vast network of oxytocin nerves, which would reach almost any place in the brain or the nervous system. And recently, it's become clear that you have it even in astrocytes everywhere. It's more like a neuroendocrine system, that you have levels of oxytocin in the brain, which then will influence every function. And it's always towards the same trend of activity: reduced stress, above all, reduced inflammation, and then it also has healing properties. But this is just a reminder that the parvoventricular system is probably older. So you can reach that from the skin more easily. You can never activate the oxytocin with the pulses from the skin. Then you need suckling or the Ferguson reflex in birth. So it's easier to activate that system. And people haven't seen it because that will not necessarily be reflected in blood levels. It just goes on in the brain and you see the effects. So remember, a complex system with a large potential for influencing functions in the brain and in the body. And you can sometimes have it all activated and sometimes just parts of it. So this is just another way of saying, sort of summarizing the effects of oxytocin you have during birth. We know that the oxytocin released into the circulation stimulates myometrial contractions. But what I didn't know, was clear of, is that it also stimulates prostaglandin release. But there is not the other way. Prostaglandins can never stimulate oxytocin. So oxytocin is more like the master system, that triggers all of these effects. And at the same time, because of this, construction of the neurons in the brain, you will have these central effects, which is then, as I said, less fear, anxiety, amygdala, less pain, less inflammation. This is the coming thing. Less stress, but more parasympathetic activity, more social interaction. And we also have the dopamine connection, which gives you well-being, feeling good, to different levels, so to say. And you get all these effects, more or less, if you stimulate the oxytocin system, in particular, the parvocellular network of oxytocin. So you see how broad it is. You can't separate these effects, really. So again, it's a separate system and activated by, more primitive stimuli, which is the baby after birth, for example, but probably also the mother who at the level of birth recedes to a more primitive physiological function. So, and this is to show you the pulses of oxytocin. It's been very difficult, to see them because they sometimes just last for 15 seconds. And you have to take a lot of samples to be able to record them. But you can also see they reach quite high levels when they really are released. And it needed, of course, to activate the receptors. And we also know that during labor, there is a continuous rise of the frequency of oxytocin pulses, but also of the size of the amount of oxytocin being released in each pulse. And at birth, there is this mega pulse of oxytocin that is really important. So we have the oxytocin, but there is also this question, of course, if we do have central effects. So if you activate the oxytocin from the, with the Ferguson reflex, when the baby's head is pressing, well, there are many studies now showing that in parallel, you will have a release of oxytocin into the brain during labor, which will adapt the brain a little bit more social. It depends on the environment and the situation, but it is activated. And you can also sort of grade it. The more oxytocin, you more tend to reach the dopamine systems, which is the positive feeling. In the beginning, it's more like inhibition of pain and stress levels and the fear. And as I told you, we have these nerves to the amygdala. It's calmed all the time. And now everybody says, yes, we have pain, yeah, but the stress system is also activated. But without a concomitant activation of the oxytocin system, it would be much worse. And that also means that if you can change the ratio between two, if you can increase the part of the oxytocin, you will have even less pain and even less stress to be sort of experienced. So, but we also need to understand that if you have a hormone like oxytocin, it is a matter of the amount of oxytocin, like, when you infuse oxytocin or you have your, but it's also the receptor, of course, that should sense it. And that one can also be differentiated. I mean, you can have a receptor that's more active or not active. So you have two components. Sometimes you can have low levels of oxytocin, but a high activity because you have a high receptor activity, and vice versa, of course. And of course, then the infusion system, when you infuse oxytocin, is extremely sort of concentrated on increasing the concentration. Whereas if you induce oxytocin release by touching, you change the activity in both of them, which is going to be far more efficient and more, I would say, more elegant. So this is just to show again that we have an autonomic innervation of the uterus, just like we have of every organ, a parasympathetic aspect and a sympathetic aspect. And the autonomic nervous system, this is some studies I found very recently because I had reason to go back and study old studies. And then I found that, of course, if you stimulate the parasympathetic nerve or the sympathetic, you get contractions without oxytocin. So it's possible to induce contractions without oxytocin. So it's probably cholinergic or some other receptor. But the other thing that was interesting is that if you can modulate stimulations, and then if you create an electrical stimulation or whatever, which is so low that you don't see any contractions, we call that subliminal. If you, upon that, infuse oxytocin in amounts that normally don't give anything, that doesn't give any contractions, you suddenly get contractions. So the sum of the two together can result in oxytocin contraction. And this also means that you can, by touch or anything that releases or activates the oxytocin system, you can get contractions without having more peaks because you probably make the system more active. And this is, so we have the oxytocin, and I would also like to say that oxytocin is interesting because it's linked to the opening of the cervix, like the opening of milk ducts. And then the contraction comes. You can't contract against closed doors. So if the arrangement in the milk ducts and in the cervix and the uterus and the mammary glands, it's completely analogous. But you can also actually, there is a difference in the sense that you can, if you take away the oxytocin gene, you can still give birth. All these animals can do because they have the parasympathetic nervous system. But you can't lactate and the pups die because there is no parasympathetic innervation of the mammary glands. So you can't survive, but you can give birth without oxytocin. It's clumsy, takes time. Now this is another very, very important figure, I think, because this is really to show that we don't only have the influence coming from the up stimulating oxytocin or stimulating contractions through the nerves. There is a feedback system, which is extremely important. And if you have So this is supposed to be some kind of a figure that shows the fetus and the uterus and the mother at the same time, what goes on during a contraction. So if you have a contraction, you will, of course, have a contraction of the muscles. And what happens then? Well, there will be less blood flow. And then there will be a different metabolism in the myometrium. And then, as a consequence of that, there will be a release, a feedback in which stops the contraction, because it can't go on like that. You need the nutrients, you need the sugar, shouldn't be too acid. And of course, at the same time, as you contract the blood for the uterus, you contract the blood for the fetus. So the contraction, which is a cause of sort of, say, oxytocin or whatever you use here, should be limited in time. Otherwise, this system will take too much time. So if you have too much oxytocin, too much contractions, you will end up in a state when you have perhaps this arrow will be much longer and the period for relaxation is less. And that's going to be damaging. It's going to and then there's another aspect. There will be more pain. And that you will have the brain is going to be informed. And then you shut down the oxytocin and you sort of go into an inhibition also at the central level. So this is in a way the opposite of the Ferguson reflex, which drives the positive aspects, but you also have a negative one. So this means that during birth, you will have a balance between these two. So the more contractions, the more negative information to stop it. And the more of the parasympathetic, the better, because that's going to have a more active promoting effect. This one, I think, has been underestimated as a nervous effect. It's as if people talk about what they feel, but it actually resets not only these local circle here, it changes also the balance in the brain. So this is just to summarize that you have the uterine contractions with hypoxia, etc., goes up to the brain and activates the stress system, which is sort of just summarized by CRF here. All of it comes, pain. And the more low intensity stimulation, you have oxytocin. And since these two interact with each other, the more you have of that, the less you're going to have of that. More oxytocin, less stress, more stress, less oxytocin. So the balance is again very, very important. And as I said, you can influence that from the outside by separately stimulate the oxytocin system. Now there is another aspect of this, also have found by reading the literature, it's not been integrated really. And that is that if you have these contractions here, you have this activation of the sympathetic nerves. And they go up to the brainstem and then up, of course, to the hypothalamus. But then what's been found that it's not only oxytocin release that's inhibited. It seems that the number of oxytocin receptor or the function, I don't know the mechanism, is also decreased. So you have a very, very elegant way of sort of inhibiting everything by this feedback nerve. So you change the receptor binding and you change probably the release of oxytocin, but the two together will lead to a very, very quick decrease of activity. That's when you have to give more oxytocin or whatever, which is not so easy when the receptors are not very well working in this situation. Now, what about amygdala then? Well, we also have stressors from the outside. So everything that we perceive as stressful is going to be, filtered through amygdala here some way. And this, this hippocampal amygdala pathway will somehow decide what is the value of what's going on outside. And depending on if it's dangerous or non-dangerous, it's going to activate the stress system or the oxytocin system, which has also not been seen before. There's an active release of oxytocin by things that we perceive as friendly, safe, rich, plentiful, whereas the stress system is, of course, a bit more well known that things are. That means, again, that you can have a situation which is stressful Okay, you can take the stress away, but you only come halfway. It's only when you also activate this other system that you get into the full oxytocin effect. So this is just to show, of course, we know that the pulses of oxytocin are extremely easily stopped by stress. And it could be noise, or it could be something else, but that's easy to understand. But what's becoming more and more clear is that there is something more, that we are reduced to at this time of life when the mothers are giving birth to a level what I would rather call it the limbic language, where we are more looking at, is this environment safe? Do I feel that somebody is supporting me? Have I been here before? More, is this dangerous? Is it safe? And I also think that I'm sort of referring to yesterday, that this includes that things should be as they are. Changes will be somehow upsetting and causing stress, because you need all to be where you should be and where you usually are. So this one is not only negative, she's social support in one way, but she's definitely going to stop your contractions, because it's immediately, because the mother is so intensely talented in interpreting facial expressions or body language or the tone of voice. So she will immediately see that she is here, but she's not. And then if you have this expression, you will not only be a person, you will even be maybe a person that stimulates something positive, the oxytocin in you, because the facial expression will make your brain feel safe and you will release your oxytocin. It's your own oxytocin, of course, but depending on what you see, you go between stress or you go between the oxytocin, which will then be, of course, linked to a quicker birth and to a better experience, because you have remember these axon collateral that went to the amygdala. That's going to cause decrease of fear, and you will have the well-being. And actually, I would say there is also, skip that slide later, now they have isolated neurons that go to the amygdala, which are involved in memory formation of pain. So, but when these are activated, memories of pain are not going to be performed. So that could also be something that is not only good for the moment, you could also sort of reset the system in the way that the stress reaction will not be remembered and will not be less risk, of course, of having stress diseases later on. So, okay, so this is just to say the limbic language, I think, is very important. It's more important in women when they give birth and later on. I think it's always important. We always have these things. It's not specific for birth, but it seems to be driven to its extreme strength during these periods, because it's so important to be in a safe environment, really. And you can discuss a lot of consequences of this when you go to hospital and everything like that. But this is really something that women are super good at. Means also that if you go into the wrong line here, you will find everything appalling and get angry and upset at everything, because you're in the other, you have this other, I would say, glasses on. And that means that sometimes midwives may say rather neutral things, but it might be perceived as angry, and because you have got into this defensive, hostile mood, which is actually the other way, the other side of oxytocin, to be a little bit protective. So again, we have this extremely important balance between CRF or stress and oxytocin, which Jonathan, I saw you, which we started to discuss yesterday, and where we have taken out everything in the literature and shown at all the pieces, all the places where you have these antagonisms. It's in the circulation, it's in the brain, it's everywhere. So these two things are really well designed to be a servo system for balancing of stress, if, of course, you know the codes. So you have to understand how to activate the two. And we all know about the stress. We know less about the positive things. This is just again to summarize, to show you how extremely many places you have these oxytocin inhibition of stress release and stress responses. So it's a system, it's not a hormone, it's not a neurotransmitter, it's a system involving all of these effects which act together. And then of course, we have, as I said, we have these positive effects on labor because you reduce stress levels and you reduce all of these things that would possibly, antagonize labor, at least make the experience worse. So that, and then we have this one that it doesn't only decrease the experience of fear, pain, and stress, it also does it into the future because it has these amnesic effect, which probably corresponds to this effect in the amygdala, which is actually, it is activated by default. Because as soon as you activate the oxytocin neurons that release oxytocin to the blood, these axon collaterals are activated. So, which is a very elegant system you have. So, and of course, if you have oxytocin released in the amygdala, less fear, less pain, you change the memories. You don't, you remember, but you change the emotional context around it. And perhaps since you reduce the long-term effects, this might help to reduce the risk of postpartum reactions, stress reactions. And I think that fits very nicely because we know, for example, that social support and some of these very nice ways of helping mothers who give birth seem to have a protective effect against not only they feel better during birth, but there is a less risk, and also with skin-to-skin contact, of developing long-term consequences. And that's because the system is reduced, the stress is during this period, but that will have consequences for a long term. So you have and if we look at this, what does the social support do? Now, in a way, we all know, of course, social support is a general phenomenon. It's nothing particular of birth. You have it in psychology. Medicine hasn't really talked so much about it, but it is there. And it is about the oxytocin release from the parvocellular neurons. You don't see it in blood. And it would give you lower stress levels, less pain. You would feel a little bit better, and you would have the release of oxytocin there. But you also have a release of parasympathetic activity, and that will have a positive effect on the oxytocin receptors. So you will have two very positive effects of social interaction. So the doula is doing exactly the same as an oxytocin infusion, but in a much smarter way, because it is actually in the right, it will use the endogenous system with the right interval between the pulses, and in addition, it's going to make the receptors more sensitive. If you give infusions, you actually go into the opposite. So this is the real system. And then, of course, we know now that you can see that if you have a supportive person, you have the duration of labor shortens, there is less stress, and there is less use of medical interventions. But that's exactly the consequence of this, that you have an increase of the natural endogenous system, not more pulses, but more efficient pulses and more sort of activity at the receptor level. So you're just reinforcing the endogenous system instead of sort of more or less making it, inhibiting it, which you do if you give oxytocin infusions. And I think it's also about, it's not only about physical and mental, but something about your own values and views and what you have in you, which can make you stay in the calm system. And of course, just a few words on skin to skin. It is the same, like social support. It's just, this is between mother and baby, and it's more touch and skin-to-skin contact. Again, oxytocin from the parvocellular neurons, parasympathetic, less sympathetic, and all of these things happen at the same time. And what I would like to just to show is that this is quite a nice model, because this is the cutaneous nerves. You activate them by touch, light, pressure, warmth. Warmth is extremely important. If you touch with a cold hand, there is no effect. But there seems to be quite an interesting differentiating effect between 34, 36 degrees. We like these temperatures on the front. And then you have these, of course, these sensory nerves going up. And then you reach the oxytocin with one neuron. And of course, then you will get the oxytocin effects, the ones I showed you before. They will come because oxytocin, the paraventricular system doesn't necessarily differentiate between the different neurons. You get the full palette, and that's why you feel so well, and why why skin to skin is so important. And of course, and we also increase the parasympathetic nerve activity, of course, because we can't increase the pulsatile oxytocin release. But we do have this increase in the parasympathetic. We do have the increase in all the neurons coming from the parvocellular neurons. So it's the same as in social contact, I would say, but it's more, you can see it a little bit more clearly. It's more skinned. And I think this also tells us that the mothers probably has a better skin sensitivity during this period of life than she has normally, because she has a more primitive physiology, not only psychology, but also physiology. The brainstem mechanism are operating. Okay, so I would say that there is now a lot of data, I'm not going into that labor may change the oxytocin system. I think that there is also, it's very likely that the skin to skin and social interaction of these kinds are more likely to do something, because they will actively activate the oxytocin system. And especially after birth, when you don't have the activity of the cortisol, of the stress system anymore, you can have an enormous effect of the oxytocin system, which can then have perhaps mediate some of these long-term effects that, Jonathan, we are going to write about in the next paper. So I think this is a system with immediate effects. It does help labor. It does make the mother feel better, but it is also protective, not only for the moment, but also in the long run. Just like having a horrible experience is also going to increase the risk of a horrible future, so to say. So it's both ways, and you can sort of modulate that. And what I would like to just stress again, that the skin is like a piano, you have different keys, and some of them will release just oxytocin, and then if you increase it, you can have oxytocin and cortisol, and then you can have only stress, it's really bad. But this is a possibility to choose and specifically activate the oxytocin system, which is not so easy otherwise, because the surrounding is so complex, but you have these nerves there. That is what I would like to tell you. So thank you very much.
Questions? I've got lots of comments. I have from a midwifery perspective. For sure.
Thank you for such an impressive presentation. From a midwifery point of view, I think many midwives, all the midwives should hear your lectures, because you have highlighted, because you have you have showed, maybe I think that you have showed the side effects of the many inductions that we do to women instead of helping them, having a more natural birth, giving more time to nature to do its work. Well, thank you for a big lesson. Yes, I've been really, you can see, very impressed. But I don't think I'm going to write what you said, because this is really, for us midwives, a big lesson. Thank you.
I'll go to the questions, Kerstin, and let you respond then, if that's okay. Thank you so much. I think you've set us all on fire.
How does epidural anesthesia interfere with this or not?
Sorry, I'm just going to give you the microphone for online.
The problem with all these interventions is that they somehow interfere with the oxytocin system. The epidurals, they anesthetize the sympathetic nerves, more or less. It's the meaning of it, which is not bad if you have too much of pain. But at the same time, it definitely blocks the input from the Ferguson reflex, which is the pulses which are linked to these activation of happiness and feeling better and the stress reduction. So you get a much more blunt experience probably of birth if you have an epidural, because you're not activating the dopamine and all these things which are naturally activated by the Ferguson reflex. I'm not saying it's deadly, but it takes away a piece of this experience and also probably part of the speed of the birth. We know that, by the way, and then you give oxytocin infusions, which is also upsetting these balances. It's easy, you can never do anything in a biological system without getting effects that you didn't expect unless you really looked for them before.
It certainly explains a lot when we all seem to be surprised that epidural increased the length of labor and it all became a bit of a shock, which is very strange. Julia.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment shortly to what about the epidurals. I mean, that's also what we see as midwives after birth. I mean, we all seen women after epidurals. They're somewhere else. They just they behave different. They're not unhappy or not, but it's a different. Yeah, it's just like what you said. So that's I think that resonates. The peak somehow. My question. All right. So that's why. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My question was at the end. You pointed, I understand, also towards prevention. You said that activating the oxytocin or the system through touch, did I understand that right, as prevention, because you can also do that later, etc. with oxytocin. My question is now, where do you see the role of breastfeeding in that? Because that's like big time active.
Breastfeeding, I think, is part of this pattern. Actually, it starts with pregnancy, so it's a big physiological entity. But the breastfeeding is very efficient, and it's you don't receive that much oxytocin any time in life as you do that, and you also have the skin to skin. So I would rather say that we've seen a lot of negative effects of epidurals, personality-wise, and all these things. But if the mother is fully breastfeeding, these effects seem to disappear after some time, but it takes full breastfeeding. So, it's not about once a day, it's about, because that's when you get the real changes. Yeah, and repeatedly. So breastfeeding is just another variant of this model, you see, yeah.
Thanks so much, Kerstin. Absolutely fantastic presentation. Just one question. You said about the skin works like a piano, or there's a really lovely analogy. Just wondering, could you give us a little bit more information about what parts of the skin that should be massaged or touched?
had time to that. Within the skin or just underneath the epithelium, you have an enormous amount of sensory nerve endings. And these nerve endings respond to very light touch or to more tougher, it's a gradual, they have different specialties, these receptors, and some of them respond to inflammation, pain, and warm temperature. We're not talking heat, that's bad. We're not talking cold, but these temperatures around 32 to 36 something seem to be extremely important. And that is the temperature of the mother's breast, the mother's skin at that time. So somehow that is extremely modifying and potentiating. So actually we've seen that mother's skin temperature is reflected into the baby's stress relaxation at the time, but also after 1 year. So the temperature is probably also, I also think that you have to consider, we have logical things, we can describe things, but there are some very basic physiological systems involved here. And temperature, I think personally, that temperature between 34, 30 is considered very nice for the babies. Maybe they trust the mother. She has something to give, she's warm. And then you have trust in a primitive sense, so to say. So you have, whereas we would be cold, they might think she's dead, So I think these signals are giving messages which are very profound. Sorry? I think so. I think, and during breastfeeding, you also have the warmth. So I think it's very, very universal, but I didn't think of it until I saw it. And I went to a conference on swimming. And do you know that people who they have also teach mothers and their children to come together. They increase bonding. The temperature of water. 26. So 34. So it's exactly the same temperature. They found that. Yeah. So temperature is important. So you have this battery of sensory nerves in your under the epithelium, but in your skin. And depending on what you do, how much holding is more efficient. I don't believe in stroking here. I think it's the holding which is important. And then you tell the brain, I'm fine or not.
Kerstin, thank you so much. I think that was fascinating and a great reminder that we're all absolutely amazing and we can now hug after COVID and stimulate our oxytocin. So that's a positive for me as a touchy-feely person. So thank you so much, Kerstin. Really appreciate it.